Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can discuss the mental health and personality factors that may be at work in the case of Peter Kürten, also known as the Vampire of Düsseldorf. Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. So first I'll look at the background of Peter Kürten, and then I'll move to the mental health and personality factors. Peter Kürten was born on May 26, 1883, just outside Cologne, Germany. He had 12 siblings, 2 of whom died when they were young, which was quite common at that time. Kürten's parents both struggled with their intake of alcohol. His father was physically abusive to everyone in the family. The entire family lived in a one-bedroom apartment. On occasion, his father would have sex with his mother, while Kürten and his siblings were forced to watch. When he was about 5 years old, Kürten would try to drown one of the neighborhood children with whom he would play. He would start torturing small animals several years later, after becoming friends with a dog catcher who lived in the same apartment building. Due to the fact that his father was physically violent toward him, Kürten ran away several times when he was young. He would learn how to be a criminal from some of the other criminals he met when living on the street. Kürten's mother would leave his father after his father was sentenced to jail for 15 months in 1894. He had committed an assault of a sexual nature against one of Kürten's sisters. In this video, when I use the term assault, that is the type of assault to which I am referring. Kürten would later claim that when he was young, he drowned 2 boys. The deaths of the 2 boys had originally been ruled accidental. When Kürten was 13, he engaged in bestiality and reported he would also stab the animals because doing so would enhance his sexual experience. In 1897, Kürten went to work because his father demanded it. He worked for 2 years before stealing from the employer and running away. He would go to prison for 1 month for the theft. Later, Kürten would say that he committed his first murder in 1899, an 18-year-old woman, but there's no evidence this actually happened. Kürten would be sentenced to 4 years in prison in 1900 after being charged with fraud and attempted murder. He was drafted into the Imperial German Army after he was released from prison. He would desert shortly after this and go on to set fires to barns and other similar structures. He was convicted of desertion, arson, robbery, and attempted robbery. He would be in prison until 1913. This brings us to May 25 of 1913. On this day, Kürten would commit the first murder that we are sure he was actually responsible for. He was burglarizing a home when he noticed a 9-year-old named Christine Klein. She was asleep in her bed when Kürten assaulted her before strangling her and slashing her with a pocket knife. The day after the homicide, he went to the local tavern to drink. He wanted to listen to people there talk about the murder. When he would hear them talk about their feelings of disgust, repulsion, and anger, he would feel a sense of gratification. Klein's uncle was actually arrested for that homicide, but he was acquitted by a jury. Kürten would commit a similar crime just 2 months later. This time the victim was a 17-year-old named Gertrude Franken. Kürten was arrested for arson and burglaries unrelated to the homicides. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, although his sentence would be extended by 2 years because of his poor behavior. After his release in 1921, he met a former prostitute and convicted murderer. She had killed her fiancé. The two would get married. They would have sex regularly, but Kürten was only able to climax when thinking about acts of violence. Kürten went to work in 1925. He and his wife would move to Dusseldorf. He started having affairs with both a housemaid and a servant. The housemaid would accuse him of assault. The servant accused him of seducing her. This was the only charge that was pursued. Kürten was convicted of seduction and threatening behavior. He would serve 6 months of an 8-month sentence. On February 3, 1929, Kürten stabbed an elderly woman 24 times with a pair of scissors that was sharpened, but she survived. Just 6 days later, he would murder a 9-year-old using scissors. 5 days after this, he killed a 45-year-old man. Kürten would attack 4 more people over the next few months. All 4 would survive. On August 11, 1929, he strangled and stabbed a woman named Maria Hahn. He would eventually bury her body in a field. 3 months after the homicide, he sent a letter to police telling them where she was buried. He would later send a letter to a newspaper which indicated the burial location of another victim. On August 21, Kürten attacked 3 people, 2 women and a man, in separate attacks. For these attacks, he had switched to using a knife. He wanted the police to believe there was more than one perpetrator at work. On August 24, he killed 2 sisters, ages 5 and 14. After committing 2 more attacks where the victims survived, Kürten would commit another homicide on September 30. The victim was a 31-year-old woman. Kürten assaulted her, then killed her with a hammer. So again, he switched weapons. On October 11, he would do the same thing to a 22-year-old woman. 2 weeks later, he would attack 2 more women. Both of them would survive. On November 7, Kürten murdered a 5-year-old girl by stabbing her with a pair of scissors. Between February and May of 1930, Kürten attacked 10 more victims. They would all survive. On May 14, 1930, Kürten lured a 20-year-old woman to his apartment and asked her to have sex. When she refused, he told her that he would take her to a hotel. Instead, he took her to a nearby forest and assaulted her. In the course of the attack, she screamed, and Kürten let her go. She wrote a letter to the police describing the attack. The police realized that her attacker may be the killer who they were looking for. The press referred to this killer as the Vampire of Düsseldorf. This victim led the police to Kürten's apartment. Kürten was not at home at the time, but he saw the police in the hallway and departed from the area. Kürten eventually confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Düsseldorf. He told her to turn him in to collect the reward. She found that offer acceptable. Kürten was arrested for murder. He confessed to 10 murders and 31 attempted murders, as well as a number of other offenses. Kürten was tried, found guilty, and given 9 death sentences, only one of which was carried out, of course. He was executed by guillotine on July 2, 1931. Now moving to the mental health and personality factors. Kürten appeared to have a mixture of both Factor 1 and Factor 2 psychopathic traits. From Factor 1, he could be manipulative, he lied frequently, he had a lack of remorse and a lack of empathy. From Factor 2, he was impulsive, irresponsible, and committed a wide range of crimes. Kürten tortured animals and committed arson many times, 2 traits that are associated with psychopathy. Like many serial killers, he started with petty crime and moved his way up to serious offenses. Kürten was active during a time that predated the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, so he didn't receive any formal diagnosis from that manual. His behavior aligns with all 7 symptoms of antisocial personality disorder: repeated unlawful behaviors, deceitfulness, impulsivity, aggressiveness, a reckless disregard for safety, irresponsibility, and a lack of remorse. Kürten was particularly sadistic. He specifically gained sexual gratification from homicide, blood, and causing other people to be disgusted. Violence facilitated him reaching climax, as well as seeing the victim's blood, and he admitted to consuming victim's blood on several different occasions. This is where they got the Vampire of Düsseldorf name. He would tell a mental health professional that many of his victims survived because he reached a climax early in the attack. So once that was accomplished, he would disengage and/or the person would be able to escape. He also enjoyed watching people realize their property was burning to the ground, so when he would commit arson, he would watch from a distance. He really enjoyed the looks of horror on the people's faces as they saw their property burning. Later, he would say that he had a hatred of society, probably believing this was more socially acceptable than his first stated motive, although a mental health professional testified that Kürten's motive was 90% sadism and 10% revenge for injustices endured both as a child and as an adult. So there might have been a hatred of society component to his behavior. Kürten's experiences in prison were unusual. He claimed that he was insubordinate for the purpose of being sent to solitary confinement, where he could indulge in destructive fantasies. There was something about being punished that helped him connect to those fantasies. So in addition to the sadism, there might have been some masochism as well. Kürten had fearless dominance. He was not afraid of anything. To him, punishment only brought more pleasure. Right before he was beheaded, he inquired as to whether he would be able to hear the blood coming out of his body, even if for a moment, because that would be pleasurable. Kürten originally pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but mental health professionals testified he knew exactly what he was doing. At his trial, a mental health professional testified that he had narcissistic personality, but of course, as I mentioned, without a DSM, he was never diagnosed with any disorder that would be in that manual, like narcissistic personality disorder. But does his behavior align with that disorder? Well, there's no way to know for sure because we don't have a lot of information. He did appear to be grandiose. He had a sense of entitlement. He was manipulative and lacked empathy. He did not have fantasies of success, brilliance, beauty, the ideal love, but one could argue that he did have fantasies of power. As far as the other symptoms, it's not clear if they would be endorsed, like believing oneself to be special, requiring admiration, or having envy. So perhaps 5 or maybe 6 of the symptoms would be endorsed. A fairly good alignment. What made Kürten different from so many serial killers was his specific interest in blood, his enjoyment of people being disgusted. That's not really something we see too often. And how many of his victims survived. Kürten was a lot like Richard Ramirez in several ways. Richard Ramirez was also known as the Night Stalker. Both would attack men and women. Both were extremely violent and sadistic, even for serial killers. Both used a variety of weapons. For Kürten, it was deliberate so he could confuse the police. Ramirez was just disorganized. Both were active in a community that was petrified by them. They were frequently in the newspaper, and people took a lot of precautions to prevent being attacked. These killers were not careful, but managed to evade capture for some time. Ramirez did so by driving around, but Kürten committed many of his crimes in one city, Dusseldorf. Both were dealt with harshly when they were young, they were maltreated, and they had terrible role models, specifically men. Kürten learned from his father, who committed crimes against Kürten's mother and against Kürten and his siblings, and Ramirez learned from his older cousin, who murdered his wife in front of Ramirez. The last similarity, their motives were similar, but Ramirez had the additional motive of stealing money for drugs, and he used drugs frequently during the time he was active. The last point I want to discuss about Kürten is his lack of empathy. I mentioned that a lack of empathy is a characteristic of both psychopathy and narcissism. This is one of the key characteristics of homicidal offenders, including serial killers. Clearly, the nature of Kürten's crimes indicate a lack of empathy, but there are a few other things that he said that also point to it. During the trial, he expressed remorse for being unfaithful to his wife, but not about the actual homicides. So he knew that he had done something wrong. He knew that she would be upset for some reason, but he chose one reason that was much less serious than another. He was asked by the judge about his conscience. He replied, "I have none. Never have I felt any misgiving in my soul. Never did I think to myself that what I did was bad, even though human society condemns it." So 2 things here. There was no guilt or shame, and typically those feelings would reduce the likelihood of somebody committing a crime. So they're like safeties that were removed in the case of Kürten. And his use of the word human is curious. Perhaps he really didn't think of himself as a human. So those are my thoughts on Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Düsseldorf. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.